The workhouse was a hallmark of Victorian Britain. In an era associated with imperial pomp and industrial revolution, the workhouse represented the vast underbelly of society, an institution that caused misery to millions and evoked shame in even more.
They were all there.
All there, yes.
Oh, how awful for them.
For the poor, the homeless, the unemployed or the ill of Victorian Britain, there were no welfare benefits and no NHS. They could starve on the streets or turn to the workhouse as a last resort.
When he died in the workhouse, was his body chucked out with the rubbish?
Astonishingly, the workhouse survived well into the modern era, until after the Second World War. In 100 years, it was home to over 16 million people caught between poverty and destitution.
She was homeless and living on the stairs.
Are you joking?
No. So,
You're joking?
No.
By the time it finally shut down in 1948, 5 million people had died in the workhouse. Today, 1 in every 10 Britons has a family connection to this formidable institution. But amongst the stories of tragedy, there are also stories of triumph against overwhelming odds.
That is absolutely extraordinary.
Yeah, Western Australia.
Extraordinary.
Now actress Felicity Kendall, actor Brian Cox, presenter Fern Britton, and best-selling author Barbara Taylor Bradford will explore how their families were driven into the workhouse by poverty. An ordeal with uncanny echoes of life in today's Britain.
The injustice of it is astonishing. It's astonishing.
And model and actress Keira Chaplin will discover how the most famous workhouse inmate of all, her grandfather Charlie Chaplin, took on the system and won.
After going through this, he probably realized that he could get through anything.
Victorian Britain, an era of rapid industrial growth, but also a time of soaring population and economic upheaval. The workhouse was adopted in 1834 as an ingenious solution to the spiralling problem of poverty. The idea was simple: humiliate the poor for asking for help, shame them into standing on their own 2 feet. In one extraordinary case, it worked. Charlie Chaplin went from the workhouse to not only stand on his own 2 feet, but to become a Hollywood superstar and one of the wealthiest men in the world. Charlie's life began here in Lambeth, in what was once one of the poorest parts of 19th century London. His granddaughter is the actress and model Keira Chaplin.
My grandfather lived here with his brother Sidney and their mother Hannah. From what I know, my grandfather grew up very poor. Hannah was a singer and she lost her voice. They struggled to find food, and I know that one of the most traumatic things that happened to my grandfather is when he had to go to the workhouse.
To qualify for help, a poor person had to satisfy the authorities that they were truly destitute, that they had no money, no job, and no place to live. Charlie Chaplin's alcoholic father had deserted the family when he was aged 9, and in July 1898, Charlie ended up here in Lambeth Workhouse with his mother and half-brother.
What would have happened to Charlie, Sidney and Hannah when they first arrived here?
Well, they would have approached the workhouse and Hannah would have made it known that she wanted to be admitted.
Okay.
At which point she would have been separated from her 2 sons. So she would have been led to the female ward, which was on this side of the building.
Okay.
And the 2 boys would have been led across the way to the children's building.
So as soon as they're in, separation right away?
Separation straight away.
Segregation was at the heart of the workhouse system. Children from their parents, wives from their husbands. By isolating individual groups of paupers, the authorities believed they could contain the toxic influence of poverty and stop the spread of degenerate behavior.
we can see from the map of the workhouse just how regimented it was. Not only do we have the male side and the female side, but there's a further Victorian designation of good and bad. This was an attempt to try to make sure that good people were not somehow punished by close proximity to bad people.
Yeah.
The architecture was designed to judge people, really, I think.
Yeah.
To make it...
To judge them and make them feel bad about themselves for being there and to scare everyone else from wanting to go there.
Absolutely. This was meant to be terrifying, so that you would do anything you could to avoid it.
When Oliver Twist famously asked for another bowl of gruel, he was hit about the head with a ladle. But Dickens wasn't exaggerating the brutality of workhouse life. To minimize the welfare bill, the system was designed to make sure that life on the inside was worse than earning a pittance on the outside. Hollywood actor Brian Cox made his name in blockbusters like Troy and The Bourne Identity. His great-grandfather, Patrick McCann, was just the type of person the authorities wanted to target. A Glasgow labourer who, like 1/3 of the city's population, managed to survive on the poverty line. But in 1897, Patrick succumbed to the Scottish version of the workhouse, the poorhouse.
It's weird because one of my greatest fears has always been poverty, and it's something I've always had, this fear of it. And when you see a history of it in the family, you begin to realise it's in the DNA.
Patrick was one of thousands of Irish immigrant workers who had flocked to Glasgow in the hope of finding work after their own country was devastated by famine. He lived in the Cowcaddens area, one of the city's poorest districts at the time, with his wife and their 8 children.
He was living in tenements like this, his family, with 40 to 50 other people in one tenement.
40 to 50?
Yes, so massively overcrowded compared to the present day, obviously.
Yeah. So how would it be divided up?
Where you would have one room, a fireplace, and one bed, and that was it for a whole family. No heating, drafty, damp.
By the late 19th century, Cowcaddens had one of the highest infant mortality rates in Europe. 1 in every 5 children died of poverty-related illnesses, including 5 of Patrick's own children.
So this is your classic close,
It is.
or tenement stair.
We all recognise this, don't we?
We do know this very well.
Annie has a record which shows just how desperate things got for Patrick's family before they turned to the workhouse.
I have this document to show you, which is actually for Sarah Maguire, who was Patrick's mother-in-law.
This is my great-grandmother.
Yes. Now you see, the bit I want to point out to you is residence, Charlotte Street, on a stair. And what that basically means is she was homeless and living on the stairs.
Are you joking?
No.
You're joking?
No.
On the stairs?
So she was sleeping, if you like, on these hard stone stairs. We talked about Patrick and his family living in these very overcrowded rooms, but poor old Sarah was on the stair.
I mean, did they not take her in?
The McCanns were having their own major difficulties at this time, and they couldn't support her.
At the turn of the century, there were over 100,000 people in Glasgow alone living in conditions similar to the McCanns.
Family structure seems to have been destroyed. It seems to have been eradicated. It seems to have been... Because, there's cannons to the left of you, cannons to the right of you. It's all around you, there's despair. And we're constantly applying for poor relief and constantly trying to keep ahead of the game. And, I talked earlier about my own fear of poverty, but I now know where it lies, and it's a reality. It's right in the system. It's there because what they went through, and just it just leaves you. It's really bad, It's really bad.
By 1900, economic expansion had made Britain the richest nation on the planet, and yet almost 1/3 of the country's urban population lived in poverty. To control the number of poor becoming dependent on what would be called welfare benefits today, paupers had to pass what was known as the workhouse test. In order to qualify for help, they had to be prepared to work 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, on mind-numbing, tedious labour like breaking rocks or picking apart old rope. Inmates were treated like prisoners, but the workhouse wasn't a prison. The door was always open and people were free to leave if they wanted. But for 1 in every 10 who came in, the only way out was in a coffin. This is what happened in presenter Fern Britton's family.
Now, I have got a copy of the death certificate of my great-great-great-grandfather. And he has the most marvellous Christian name of Friend. He's called Friend Carter, and he died in the workhouse. And whatever he did well, because we're all right now. That lovely name, Friend.
Like a quarter of the population of Victorian Britain, Friend scraped a living working on the land. The upheaval of industrialisation and rural unemployment led to riots throughout his home county of Kent. But despite this turmoil, Friend was a model worker and managed to stay out of the workhouse even in old age.
Right, so here we have the 1871 census.
Yes.
Can you see who we've got on there?
Ah, yes.
There's Friend Carter. And can you see what he's doing
It
there?
says agricultural labourer.
So he's still working at the age of 64. And it's hard work. It wouldn't have been easy for him.
God, what an extraordinary man.
And he's living with his daughter Harriet at this time. People relied on each other then, especially in the family. The family unit was very, very important because there was no backup, really.
No other pension, no income, nothing.
No, that's right.
To the Victorians, the family unit was sacred. By threatening to break up families, the workhouse played on the worst fears of society. But even the strongest families were defeated sometimes by poverty. In 1879, the youngest of Friend's 10 children, Jessie, was taken ill with angina, a heart condition. The workhouse was one of the few places the poor could get free health care. And although conditions inside were dire, Friend had no choice but to take his son there as a last resort.
Oh my goodness, yes.
So that's when he was...
January 1879. Carter Jessie, age 23. Date of discharge, April. So January, February, March, April. So he said 3 or 4 months.
Yes.
Well, that's good. He didn't go there any longer then.
Ah, yes, but then we found him in the 1881 census, and he is in hospital in London.
Oh, gosh. So Friend must have been worried about him.
Jessie's medical condition was so serious he was transferred to a London hospital. But what Friend didn't know was that this would turn out to be a fate worse than death. The earliest workhouses appeared in the 17th century, but it was the Victorians who first used them as the basis of a national welfare strategy. At its peak, there were 700 workhouses in England, housing over 250,000 people. Each was run by a master and matron, and the largest ones, like Lambeth, held over 1,000 inmates at a time. Charlie Chaplin came here as a child with his mother Hannah and his half-brother Sidney. Today, the building has been converted into a cinema museum in Charlie's honour. In this very room, now used for screening films, Charlie and his brother met up with their mother 1 week after they first arrived. Charlie gave an account of that reunion in his autobiography.
How well I remember the poignant sadness of that first visiting day. The shock of seeing Mother enter the visiting room, garbed in workhouse clothes. How forlorn and embarrassed she looked. In 1 week she had aged and grown thin, but her face lit up when she saw us. Sydney and I began to weep, which made Mother weep. Eventually she regained her composure and we sat together, our hands in her lap while she gently patted them. She smiled at our cropped heads and stroked them consolingly, telling us that we would soon be all together again.
But the family's moment of reunion was to be all too brief. After 8 days, Charlie and Sydney were sent to a pauper school on the edge of London, leaving Hannah alone in the workhouse.
A week or two later, Hannah ended up in the infirmary with what's described as dermatitis and bruises all over her body. She's somehow been victimised, picked on, hit. We don't know whether it's by staff or by other inmates, but she's physically suffered some kind of abuse.
In the workhouse infirmary, Hannah would have had her wounds cleaned and dressed. For her pain, she would have been given opium.
How many days did Hannah spend in the infirmary?
It seems she spent about 9 days here, and then after a couple of months she was transferred from the workhouse to Cane Hill Lunatic Asylum.
Wow, so basically 7 weeks after being here, ends up in the insane asylum. This place sounds like hell. Horrifying.
Officially, physical punishment wasn't allowed, although unofficially, abuse was commonplace. This is partly what made the workhouse such a feared institution. But the torment of life inside wasn't just physical. It was also psychological, as inmates were stripped of their dignity. Barbara Taylor Bradford is one of Britain's highest-earning novelists. She is best known for her rags-to-riches saga, A Woman of Substance, the first of a series of books featuring illicit affairs and skeletons in family closets. Recently, research for her biography revealed that Barbara's own family history concealed a secret from her mother's past that could have come straight off the pages of one of her novels.
I first found out that my grandmother, Edith Walker, and my mother, Frida Walker, had been in the workhouse. And I never knew any of this, but I received the manuscript of my biography, and I couldn't believe it. I actually burst into tears. This is the only photograph my mother had of my grandmother, Edith Walker, and she looks like quite a young madam there with a hand on her hip and the lace collars and cuffs. And she doesn't look like somebody who's poor.
Edith took Barbara's mother, Frida, to Ripon Workhouse in Yorkshire when Frida was 6 years old.
I really cried one day because I couldn't imagine my mother, who was a very sweet and rather reserved woman, as a little girl put in the workhouse. And then it leads to that awful question, why?
The workhouse was so hated that many poor families stuck together through thick and thin to avoid its clutches. This was the case with Fern Britton's family, until a heart condition forced one member, Jesse Carter, into a Kent workhouse for treatment. Jesse's condition became so bad that he was transferred to a London teaching hospital.
I don't like the idea that we're in this operating theatre. Was he alive or dead? What happened?
No, he was alive when he came here, but he was a very sick person when he came here. And unfortunately then, he dies on the 1st of May. And given the amount of pain that he's in, it was probably a relief, actually, that he'd gone. Now, the hospital is very keen, at this point, to obviously find out why a young man like that would have died, of course, because we're in a period when there's a limit. Absolutely, and all these people are standing around here.
Oh, you're going to tell me he was here being post-mortemed?
Yes, he was here being. Yeah. Oh. Yeah. And it's at this point that he could go for further medical work. And it really depends on the family. So if they've got enough money, then his body will go back to them and they will take care of it. If not, then he'll go off for dissection. And in fact, many medical students in this room would have paid extra money in order to dissect someone like Jess.
So poor Jessie, he's died, the message gets down to Kent, and what do the family do? We know they're on the breadline.
From their point of view, this is a huge question for them, because it's not just about the body, but it's also about Jess's afterlife, because that's the belief at the time. And what they were most frightened of was the sort of things that would happen in these photographs, because as you can see, dissection doesn't just mean slightly cutting the body, it means cutting it a lot, because obviously you're learning from it.
When were these photos taken?
Well, this photograph is in Cambridge, and this is exactly the sort of dissection room that he would have gone to.
It just seems so strange that paupers presumably had no civil rights over their own bodies and what would happen to them afterwards.
No, there's a piece of legislation, it's called the Anatomy Act of 1832, and it basically says that for the crime of poverty, and it was regarded as a crime at the time, you will be dissected. It was your fault that you'd not climbed up out of this situation. And the way to repay your welfare debt, for Jess, is to go for dissection. So we'll care for you in life, provided that you repay your welfare debt to society in death.
I always think of the Victorians as philanthropic, very religious, God-fearing, charitable, kind. And yet, if you were living on the poverty line, you were considered scum. You were a criminal because you'd never made it up to the next rung of the ladder. And because of that, you were penalised. So much so that you gave your body when you died. That was it. And what happened to Friend? We know he was 92 and he died in the workhouse. Was his body chucked out with the rubbish?
By the beginning of the 20th century, Britain was accelerating into the modern age. Cars were appearing on the roads, the telephone was becoming widely used, and the first X-ray machines were being installed in London's private hospitals. The workhouse too was modernising. The standard of food, education and healthcare inside was now better than the conditions a pauper could expect outside. But despite the material improvements, workhouse inmates remained tainted by the stigma of failure. Barbara Taylor Bradford's mother, Frida, was in Ripon Workhouse as a little girl aged 6.
It's a bit of a shock because, well, people look down on families that went into the workhouse.
Barbara's biographer, Piers Dudgeon, has found a clue as to why Barbara's family ended up in the workhouse. They're meeting outside the Ripon house where Barbara's mother, Frida, was born.
What are these papers you're holding?
Well,
now, come on, show them. They've got a secret, I'm sure.
Well, this tells us, this is in
1904.
fact... 1904. This is a birth certificate.
Yes.
It is a birth certificate of a little girl called...
Frida. My mother. Let me see the date. Yes, 3rd of June, 1904.
Mother, Edith Walker, domestic servant, living at 9A Waterskullgate.
Ripon. And what's that? There's a cross through it. Name of father.
Name of father is left blank. So all that we know is that Edith
Are you
came
telling
back.
me my mother was illegitimate?
Yes, that seems to be without a doubt. A very interesting situation. We have Frida, the firstborn, with no father on the birth certificate. And then we have the name of the second child she has, again illegitimately, Fred. So Frida and Fred. And then we have a third child.
Yes, name of father missed off.
So she is having these children now at regular intervals.
Well, I hope it was the same man.
But the only difference that we have between these three birth certificates
Yes.
is that Edith had her first child at 9A,
Yes, in
Waterscale
that
Gate.
room there.
And
alone.
the next two she had at this place, 75 Allhallowgate.
Whose house was that?
75 Allhallowgate isn't a private residence at all. It's the address of Ripon Workhouse.
Oh dear.
Barbara's grandmother Edith came here in 1907 and again in 1910 to give birth, having been shunned by her family. There were over 7,000 illegitimate births a year in workhouses all over the country, as the institution was increasingly being used by the poor for free health care. In Glasgow, Brian Cox's great-grandfather Patrick McCann suffered a serious injury, rendering him disabled and unemployed at the age of 40. His wife had died, making him a single parent, bringing up his son Samuel, aged 6, by himself. Patrick and Samuel were familiar faces at the poorhouse gates.
24th of July 1899. Another application from Patrick. Got bronchitis. Grant order for self and Boyd. 11th of February 1901. Order granted for Barnhill Poorhouse for self and Samuel, certified with bronchitis. Following month, he reapplies. 1902, 1903, 1903, 1903. It just kept going in and out. It's unbelievable. And the boy, this is his life. Poorhouse to poorhouse to poorhouse, this wee boy. In, out, in, out, in, out, in, out, in, out. Doesn't make any sense. It's just appalling.
Patrick was a sick man when he went into the poorhouse, but the moment he was well enough to work, he was thrown out. He would then fall sick again, go in to be patched up, only to end up back on the streets. For 14 years, Patrick was put through this ordeal time and time again, as his health became forever worse.
He's a statistic, my great-grandfather. All related to poverty, all related to how we don't take care of people. It's this assault on human dignity, this endless assault on human dignity. We've got to rub their faces in it, you know. But this, look at it, the whole book is about that, you know. Ridiculous. And then, oh my God, the 19th of June. The 19th of June 1911, Patrick McCann is declared insane by Dr. Thomas. Oh, it's just awful. I mean, it's just down this, you know, this spiral into the abyss. And finally he goes nuts. Oh, Christ.
Patrick was 54 years old when he was sent to Gartloch Asylum. At the time, he was one of 45,000 old and infirm paupers who were moved from workhouses to asylums around the country because the authorities didn't know what else to do with them. By today's standards, the treatment they received was primitive: physical exercise for therapy and opium for sedation. Charlie Chaplin's mother, Hannah, was also committed to an asylum after she was separated from him in Lambeth Workhouse. Charlie was sent to live in a school for poor children, miles away from the life he'd known. He was one of over 800 pupils here at Hanwell Industrial School. Alongside literacy and numeracy, children were also taught trades like carpentry, metalwork and tailoring to set them up for future employment. Today, Charlie's old school is a community and sports centre.
I can imagine most children, when they got here, including my grandfather, they must have been extremely malnourished, frail.
Yeah, I mean, children who came from the centre of town, which is where Charlie came from, would have been some of the poorest children in London. In fact, probably some of the poorest children in the country, actually.
They have physical activity, sports.
They did. I mean, they were taught how to swim and running, jumping, tumbling, jumping over ropes, skipping. Sports were quite important.
It makes me wonder, because my grandfather in his work, he was very physical. He was his own stuntman. He knew how to walk on a tightrope. He knew how to roller skate. He knew how to fall and roll. So I wonder if this is the place where he learned a lot of physical activity.
Yeah, absolutely. Here's a picture, and this is it's actually got Charlie down there.
Yeah. They look like a crafty little bunch.
Yeah, they do. They kind of got chubby faces, so they must have been, pretty well fed.
The school wasn't only concerned with the child's physical welfare, but also its moral discipline. The gym used to double up as the punishment room. Penalties included reduced food rations, regular beatings, and being locked up in a windowless cell for up to 24 hours.
Every Thursday, the names of the kids that had misbehaved were read out in the playground, and on Friday, they were punished. All the boys would be brought in here, and then there'd be a desk like this, and they would be lined up. It was only the boys; the girls weren't beaten, and it was only the boys aged over 7. Charlie's name was read out, and he was accused of setting fire to the toilet block. And actually, Charlie didn't do it. But he decided, that he was going to say something different. So this is what happens.
Are you guilty or not guilty, he asked. Nervous and impelled by a force beyond my control, I blurted out, guilty. I felt neither resentment nor injustice, but a sense of frightening adventure as they led me to the desk and administered 3 strokes across my bottom. The pain was so excruciating that it took my breath away. But I did not cry out, and although paralyzed with pain and carried to the mattress to recover, I felt violently triumphant. Being an actress myself, I can kind of see the joy of having the whole room staring at you and getting the punishment, being able to control your emotions and feeling triumphant. I think my grandfather learned a lot of discipline here. Mostly he learned how to become a stronger person and a more independent person, and I think after going through this, he probably realized that he could get through anything.
In 1913, Charlie moved to Hollywood, where he turned his experience of poverty into cinema gold with his classic comic persona, the Little Tramp. 2 years later, aged 26, he was earning the equivalent of $8 million a year, making him one of the highest paid people in the world. He went on to co-found United Artists, still one of the most famous studios in Hollywood today. But Charlie never forgot his mother and rescued Hannah from the asylum in 1921. She spent her last 7 years in luxury in California, a world away from the workhouse. Charlie's success may be unique, but the resistance he showed against all the odds is shared by other workhouse inmates, people who took on the system and left a legacy of courage and defiance for future generations. Barbara Taylor Bradford's grandmother came to Ripon Workhouse twice as an unmarried woman to have illegitimate children. Each time she was accompanied by her eldest child, Barbara's mother, Frida. The workhouse has been conserved as a museum, and this is the first time Barbara has set foot in the building. Now she will see for herself the place that her mother kept secret all her life.
My mother was 6. Very young to be in the workhouse, and I'm sure there was that feeling of embarrassment and shame.
This is the bathroom, of course, you see. Your mother would have had to be bathed when she came in and searched. Anything private was all taken away.
Why all private things were taken away?
Because you were put into a public workhouse uniform, and even your clothes were taken away.
And what is this?
Now this is the disinfestation of their clothing to take any lice out or anything like that.
I see.
Everything was bundled up and they fumigated it. Your mother would have been dressed.
Oh, a brown dress and a little, well, a pinafore, really.
A pinafore, yes.
Over 30,000 children ended up in workhouses every year. The only toys there were had to be shared amongst everybody. All inmates were given 3 meals a day, a watery porridge called gruel, bread, and occasionally meat. Life was ruled by a strict timetable of work and sleep, with little free time. Those who entered the workhouse were often determined never to return. Alma Scaife came here in 1942. She was just 6, the same age as Barbara's mother when she was here.
What are your memories of this workhouse?
Just the frightenness. No, very unhappy.
Bad memories?
Yeah. Cardboard in your plimsolls to go to school. I didn't think my bairns were going like that, no way.
Is that how you went to
Yes,
school?
we did.
With cardboard in your tennis shoes?
You're not proud of it, I hate to say I've lived there, but I'm proud of what I've become.
When I was growing up, and I was about 16 or 17, my mother said, I want you to have a better life than I had. Did you ever think that or say that to your children?
Yes. They had the best of everything. Everything. My children didn't have a hand down like I had. Everything I wore was given. My children, if I had anything given, it went in the bin.
So you did give them a better life
Oh,
than
yes,
you
yes.
had.
Always Clark's shoes. Always Ladybird clothes. They've had everything, my children.
My mother did say to me many times, I want you to have the kind of life I should have had. And I often wondered what she meant, and I would think, isn't she happy with my father? And they seem to be. And I think what she was thinking of is this place. I think being in Ripon Workhouse actually gave her that determination and that toughness and that will to make me have a different life, to give me the opportunities that she didn't have, basically, to be a lady.
Frida's success in bringing Barbara up can be seen as a triumph for the workhouse as a deterrent. But it was also a system that could be devastatingly cruel, especially to those who fell foul of the authorities. In Glasgow, Brian Cox is trying to find out why his sick and disabled great-grandfather, Patrick McCann, was never given the level of healthcare he needed in the poorhouse.
Irene. Hi.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. So, what a saga.
It is indeed.
So many times in and out, in and out.
Yeah.
Is that regular, or was he the exception, or was he the rule?
Well, he goes into the poorhouse. They are looking to diagnose his health problems, and they have decided he's well enough to come out of the poorhouse after 4 days and 5 days each time. He's never in very long, which suggests his health is not chronic in the sense that he's off for months. Sometimes people have been there for months. That's not the case in terms of Patrick. And then in 1905, he's classified as a C10.
What does that mean?
There's a description in that book here. Can I just get this volume?
This one?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, there you go.
Now, this is what they thought he was. Don't know if you want to look at that category 10 there. 10th class there.
Bastards. Malingerers and others of questionable character. To be sent to Barnhill for thorough diagnosis, probationary treatment, thereafter transferred if necessary. Malingerer.
A malingerer.
Do you think that was accurate?
Probably not, because what they did was at the beginning...
He had this injury?
He had an injury, and he suffered from bronchitis, but they don't feel that his illness is genuine. They decided about who was the deserving and the undeserving poor, and they decided in this case he was undeserving.
He was undeserving.
I mean, it is a very harsh system, there's no doubt about it.
It's horrible.
Yeah, it's a horrible system.
It's horrible, and the man's a victim.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just atrocious.
I mean, times are really harsh, and what you get is lots of cases of drunkenness, criminality, but what it is about most is grinding poverty. That's
exactly,
what it is.
but
It's about
within
grinding.
4 years, they're sending these people in front of machine guns to fight a war for them on their behalf. You know? I mean, the injustice of it is astonishing. It's astonishing. And it's an outrage. It's an absolute outrage of what they did to these people.
Sadly, that's a lot of people's life in
I
Glasgow.
know, that's what I mean.
Absolutely, it is
I mean,
absolutely.
I'm not just saying it in terms of my great-grandfather's life. I'm saying that the system sucks big time.
Yeah.
And it should never have happened.
I mean, it is a terrible system. I don't think there's any doubt
Appalling,
about
appalling.
it.
I mean, just cruel beyond belief.
By classifying people into categories, the workhouse treated paupers according to how deserving they were of help. It was a ruthless system, designed to judge the poor, without ever addressing the problem of how to deal with poverty itself.
For my family, who had nothing but appeared to be very good people, and they were trying their very, very hardest to do what they could. They were trying not to be a drain on society, and yet the odds were totally stacked against them. They would never have been able to get out of where they are now. Never. How does one climb out of the gloom? How do you do it?
Fern Britton's ancestor, Jesse Carter, was, in all likelihood, dissected for medical science because his family were too poor to pay for his funeral. Jesse's father, Friend, worked all his life to avoid the shame of the workhouse, but the records show he ended up dying there.
You can see the reference to Friend having been admitted to the Strood workhouse when he was about 91 years old.
He kept out for 91 years?
It's incredible, yes, yeah. So I'll just, if we have a look through here, it's quite amazing that someone should live that long anyway at this time, especially someone who had probably done sort of a lot of manual labour during his working life. And on this page here, you can see...
Carter Friend, there he is. Name of informant, self. Friend managed to bring himself in.
On the next page, you've got the actual dates.
Oh, I can see the word.
Yeah.
Dead. Gosh. I don't know why, 120 years later, that is so... You know, you sort of hope that things would have improved for him. But it didn't. Is the possibility that he had to give his body to medical science too, or what did they do with him?
I can shed a little bit more light on what happened to Friend. Obviously...
Carter Friend, age 91, parish of Cliff, where buried?
Walden.
Who would have paid for that burial?
And can you see those letters?
It says F.
Family.
Family?
Yeah. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
So they did, they came to collect him.
Looks that way.
And they buried him even though they had nothing. Oh my goodness. Well, he must have been very well thought of. So he did get a burial somewhere?
Yeah. He had a proper Christian burial.
Wow.
1/3 of all workhouse inmates were over 65 years old. Like thousands of other paupers, Friend had been using the workhouse as a retirement home. And remarkably, after he died, it was discovered that he'd even managed to squirrel away a nest egg.
Well, well, well.
I suspect that it might have been his money put by for his funeral.
His funeral fund?
Yeah, yeah. Because...
So he would still not be a drain on the family?
Yes.
Even though at the age of 91, finally he had to relinquish himself to the workhouse.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, he was still fighting that whole issue of being a pauper.
Yeah. So astonishing, really.
What a marvellous man. Thank you, Alison.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
Next time, Felicity Kendall discovers the workhouse secret in her family.
Born in the house. She's a goer, isn't she?
Brian Cox eventually finds hope in the tragic story of his great-grandfather, Patrick.
Oh my God! My mother would have been 2.
Right.
So you would have seen his granddaughter?
Yes, yes.
And Barbara Taylor Bradford discovers how her mother's siblings were sent from the workhouse to the other side of the world.
I just feel a terrible sadness at this moment.
The Paradise family continue to deal with Pauline's new life, and on top of all that, Heather's got a surprise for Ashley. It's Love and Marriage tomorrow night at 9. Stay with us, the news is next.
The workhouse was one of the hallmarks of Victorian Britain. In an era before the welfare state, it was home to the poor and unemployed who had nowhere else to turn. But to stop it being used as an easy option, the workhouse was designed to be an experience people dreaded.
Anyway, Mary, thank you for being such a brave woman.
This much-feared institution didn't finally shut its gates until 1948. In just over 100 years, 16 million people had passed through its doors. These were the massed ranks of Britain's underclass, the unemployed and homeless, segregated and stigmatized by a society which regarded poverty as a crime.
It's really bad. It's really bad.
1 in every 10 people in Britain today has a family connection to this notorious institution through a direct relative.
I think a lot of things were not told to me because she was either ashamed or embarrassed. Oh dear.
To keep out the undeserving poor, in today's terms benefit scroungers, workhouse life was made so harsh that only the desperate would consider going there.
Within 4 years, they're sending these people in front of machine guns to fight a war for them on their behalf.
But as the workhouse moved into the 20th century, its original mission to punish the poor was replaced by new ideas about social welfare. Workhouse inmates now had the chance to start afresh with renewed hope and meaning.
My mother would have been 2.
Right.
So you would have seen his granddaughter?
Yes, yes.
Actor Brian Cox and novelist Barbara Taylor Bradford will discover how their families eventually escaped the workhouse. And actress Felicity Kendall will trace her family's workhouse secret from tragedy to triumph in the face of overwhelming odds.
That's mind-bending. Well done, Bert, little boy. Fantastic.
The Victorians were people of high moral principle, God-fearing and Christian. To them, the workhouse was not just a place for the poor and the helpless, it was also where social outcasts ended up when they fell foul of this highly ordered society. Actress Felicity Kendall's great-grandmother, Mary Liddell, had little choice but to go to the workhouse when she broke this strict moral code.
I believe this house has something to do with my great-grandmother, of whom I know nothing.
Yes, your great-grandmother, Mary Liddell, did in fact live here. And she would have actually been in this very room at some point where we are now sat. Well, we do know that she married in 1880 to a chap called John Liddell.
Yes, the only photograph that I have of my great-grandparents is of John.
Felicity's great-grandparents, John and Mary, set up home in the Cumbrian town of Dalton-in-Furness. During 18 years of marriage, they successfully raised 9 children together. But in 1898, at the age of 41, Mary gave birth to a 10th child, Albert, and everything changed.
1898, Albert Edward Liddell. You can see where he was born, in the workhouse.
Why would you go from a family where you had all those children and a lovely husband called John to suddenly having your baby on the floor in the workhouse, or not necessarily on the floor?
I think the answer lies in this box, which tells us the name and surname of the father. Yes. It's blank. He's illegitimate.
Oh my goodness me. So then he would he have thrown her out then, probably?
It would appear that John was not happy.
Having become pregnant by an extramarital affair, Mary joined the thousands of other disgraced women forced to give birth in the workhouse because of the social stigma of illegitimacy. Some workhouses even had special uniforms for these women, waspish yellow and black stripes, calculated to shame them and to warn others to avoid them. Albert was one of 7,000 children born illegitimately every year in workhouses, people who would forever have to live with the stigma of starting life on the lowest rung of society. But soon after Albert was born, Mary managed to escape the workhouse and get a job as a maid, here at High Force Forge. She and little Albert shared the attic dormitory with 5 other staff.
Goodness gracious. There's no space at all, and the windows are just, they're on the floor. And little Albert would have looked out onto that exact site of the trees and the snow at some point. And this would have been his first home. It must have been absolutely magical. It's like a little doll's house for a boy who all he knew was the workhouse. To come here, it must have been a little bit like a sanctuary in a sense, you know, a sanctuary of escape. And his mother must have thought, OK, now there is hope.
But this sanctuary would be all too short. Soon after Albert's 3rd birthday, there was a knock on the door, and government officials arrived to take the 1901 census.
Now, sometimes the mistakes on a census can tell us even more information than the information which has been put in. Now, if we have a look here, we have Mary Liddell, where she's down as a servant, age 44, and we look at her condition of marriage. Now, there's a very big capital M there, which means married. But beneath that, there is W-I-D.
Widow.
Widow. Now, it would appear that she initially told somebody she was a widow.
Why?
Being a woman on her own, with quite obviously an illegitimate child, would have had great social stigma. What sometimes happened is the women passed themselves off as widows.
Yes.
Say, oh, my husband died, that's why he's not with me. The rather horrifying possibility is that when she applied for this job here, she told them she was a widow. Then when the census comes to be filled in, somebody said, well, actually, she's not a widow. Her husband lives down the road. This might have been her undoing. Because we do know at some point after 1901, she ended up back in the workhouse again. And that little M there might have caused it.
Oh my goodness me.
In 1901, Queen Victoria died and the Edwardian era began. The Victorian workhouse had become an institution with a toxic reputation. Like ex-prisoners, former workhouse inmates faced prejudice and mistrust when they came out and tried to get on with their lives. In Ripon, North Yorkshire, Barbara Taylor Bradford's grandmother, Edith Walker, was an inmate of the local workhouse. Like Mary Liddell, she also went in to give birth illegitimately. Now, Barbara is trying to find out how Edith and her children, including Barbara's mother Frida, managed to get out. She's examining the workhouse registers.
They record when individuals and when families were admitted into the workhouse and also when they left.
So many names, so many people
I know.
passed into
I know.
that place.
It makes you realise, doesn't it?
Oh. Walker Frida, my mother. Oh my.
Barbara has found her mother's name, along with those of her mother's siblings.
Edith, Frida, Fred and Mary. They were all there.
All there, yes.
Oh, how awful for them. And how long were they there?
To find out when they left, we have to look at the pages on this side. Yes.
Here, Walker, Edith, October the 15th, Saturday, last meal before discharge would be beef for breakfast.
That's right.
What's
There's a
this?
nice observation here. It says to be married to
John Simpson.
J. Simpson.
And that's why she came out of the workhouse.
Right.
It's very touching. He must have been a good man. He took on 3 children, as well as my grandmother. Well, that really solves the problem, doesn't it?
Barbara's grandmother Edith and her illegitimate children left the workhouse on October the 15th, 1910. That very day, they all walked around the corner to Ripon Cathedral, where Edith married John Simpson. But this wasn't quite the happy ending it appeared to be, and before long, Barbara's family would find themselves back at the workhouse gates. The workhouse was designed to provide food, shelter and basic health care for the innocent poor, whilst putting off the idle poor from using it as a soft option. But by the beginning of the 20th century, it had become a victim of its own success. The pauper inmates were now almost exclusively the old, the young and the sick. Actor Brian Cox's great-grandfather, Patrick McCann, was an unskilled labourer, an Irish immigrant fleeing from the famine. He had come to Glasgow to find work, but an accident left him disabled and unemployed. Patrick, also suffering from bronchitis, became a familiar face at the workhouse gates. However, the authorities doubted his integrity and branded him a malingerer, someone who was trying to cheat the system.
Malingerers and others of questionable character. Bastards.
Living in Glasgow's poorest districts, Patrick's health got worse and worse until he eventually ended up here at Gartlock Asylum, outside the city. Brian wants to know how Patrick's problems spiraled out of control before he was finally declared insane.
If you look at the illnesses, they're fairly typical. Bronchitis, chronic bronchitis. He has hernia as well, but that's being a labourer on 60 shillings a week. He would not have been able to afford a GP, nor would have been insured for GP care. So the poorhouse was basically his general practitioner care.
So that was like going to the doctors?
Yeah. Yeah.
So every time he went to the poorhouse, it was because he needed some kind of treatment.
That's right.
I mean, if he was ill, and they could diagnose his illness, why did they give him this thing of, that he was a malingerer?
They felt that individuals such as Patrick should have been able to look after themselves better.
What do you think?
Highly unlikely.
Highly impossible.
Specialised medical treatment had to be privately paid for, but in the 1880s the workhouse introduced professional nursing and separate infirmaries for the poor, developments that formed the bedrock of the modern NHS. But Patrick wasn't seeking help just for himself. His wife had died, making him a single parent in sole charge of his 6-year-old son, Brian's great-uncle, Samuel.
He applied to have Samuel taken into care, but from the records it cleared that they refused in the first instance.
Why would they refuse?
It was not normal to take up a parent's request like that at the time, because that would seem to be that you were giving in to the parent. If they accepted Samuel in, they would probably have thousands of parents trying to bring their children in to be fostered out, which was not their policy.
Is it nowhere taken into account that this boy has lost his mother's died, and that his father is a single parent?
Not at that time, because there would be many children with either mothers or fathers looking after them, i.e. in single
So who
parent.
was expected to look after them?
His father was expected to look after him.
And also work?
And also work.
He's just emblematic, my great-grandfather, emblematic of an epidemic of poverty. And he's trying to give validity to his life, you see that. You see that he's trying to deal with his son, he's trying to deal with... and his own dignity, you know, this endless attack on your dignity. He just fought the system. He said, no, I'm battling on. So there's something heroic in his story in the end. Sorry, it's very upsetting, this. The man was trying to make sense of it. And I think that's the legacy that he leaves his great-grandchildren, is trying to make sense of it.
As the 20th century unfolded, the workhouse began to take on a more caring role, especially with regard to the welfare of the young. The Victorian image of Oliver Twist and child labour was replaced by the Edwardian ideal of Peter Pan, a model of childhood innocence we would all recognise today. The workhouse was given new powers to adopt children it deemed at risk from unsuitable parents, even if that meant breaking up the family unit. Felicity Kendall's great-grandmother, Mary Liddell, stood accused of squandering her family security by having an extramarital affair. After giving birth to Albert in the workhouse and a brief period of employment, Mary was about to end up there a second time at the age of 45.
Well, I'm quietly dreading the next bit, actually, because I don't know how going back to the workhouse twice can end happily. I don't think the dice are going to roll in her favour, quite frankly.
Mary's workhouse records are kept at the Cumbria Archives in Barrow-in-Furness.
We have a record for her from 1902.
And that's in here, is it?
This is in here.
Little Claude. Who's Claude?
Well, if you follow along...
Born in the house?
Yeah, mother.
Mary Liddell. Illegitimate. And she's had another one. She had another one?
Yes.
Do you know this woman is an extraordinary creature?
I think...
And at her age, Jesus, she's a goer, isn't she? But where's Albert? Shouldn't he be here?
He should.
So where is he?
Well, if we go to the minutes of the Board of Guardians...
Medical officer's report. Recommendation. Albert Edward Liddell, aged 4, be under the control of the guardians until he attain the age of 18 years.
He's taken into the control of the guardians.
This is too much to bear.
It's a new practice that has come in. The Board of Guardians is allowed to adopt children that they feel are in danger. Children whose parents have died, children whose parents are in prison, or children whose parents are of a low moral standing. And I really think that they would have tarnished Mary with that brush, whether or not she deserved it. And it's this Victorian ideal that if a woman has an illegitimate child or a child that's the result of adultery, the woman is responsible for the sin.
It's heartbreaking.
In 1902, Albert was taken into the custody of the workhouse in Ulverston in Cumbria. Previously, only orphans and abandoned children had been adopted by the guardians. Now, any vulnerable child could be forcibly removed from its parents and taken into care. That year, there were over 7,000 children like Albert in workhouses across the country. The earliest examples of a child welfare policy we still have today. At Ulverston, Albert was housed in a special children's block and segregated from the adult inmates, including his mother. 12 months after he was taken into care, Mary applied to the guardians to try to take Albert back.
This is July 1903. So this is a year after Albert's been adopted.
The application of Mary Little for her son Albert, who had been adopted by the guardian, been not granted. Oh dear, this is getting grimmer by the minute, isn't it? So Albert, at this point, she cannot have back.
No, she's lost all parental right to him.
Yes. Albert, little Albert. And he was, how old was he now then?
He was been almost 5, I think.
Almost 5.
In Scotland, a different type of childcare scheme was being tried. Rather than raising pauper children inside the workhouse, they were fostered out to new families far away, offering them the chance of a new life. Brian Cox's great-grandfather, Patrick McCann, sought to have his son Samuel fostered out. He was initially refused. When Samuel was 10, the authorities relented and agreed to send him to a family in Ayrshire. The farmstead Samuel lived in is now derelict.
So where have you brought me now?
This is where Samuel would have been boarded out, fostered out to this farmstead here. As you can see, it's a far cry from Glasgow and the Cacaddens and Barnhill.
You can actually see the sky here a wee bit.
Well, this is actually the Doon Valley.
Oh, this is Burns. We're right in there. This is your banks and braes of Bonnie Doon.
Well, you can see
How can you bloom so fresh and fair?
You can see the banks and braes here very easily. And this would be the suit of clothing, and a set of suits of clothing he'd be issued with. And then each year he was here to get another new set of clothing, and it would enable him to be otherwise indistinguishable from any local boy. The last thing they would want to do would be to make him appear a pauper in this particular area and perhaps be called
So a lot of
names.
this, I have to admit, there's quite a bit of care has gone into this.
Yes.
Just when you're about to write somebody off, you just suddenly see something like this, which is very dear. So would these be the dwelling houses?
Yes. These would be the farmstead dwelling houses where farm servants and their families would live.
And he would be with the farm servants?
He would be with a farm servant, yes. By coming here, Samuel could start a new life, very distant from his life in the slums.
We've spent 4 years since he first went into the poorhouse with his father. And it's taken Patrick all that time to convince these people to put his boy into care.
Yes.
It's the fact that he just persisted, he just went on, you know. It's heartening. He got his lad out of it.
Samuel was one of over 6,000 children to be fostered out to families in Scotland every year. With a strong tradition of community welfare, Scottish children were able to start new lives, free from the weight of poverty. The success of bringing up children in crofters' cottages like these led to the scheme being adopted in England at the end of the 19th century, paving the way for the modern foster home system. Meanwhile, an even more radical child welfare policy was gaining momentum, to send poor children to the other side of the world. In Ripon, North Yorkshire, Barbara Taylor Bradford is in the town hall trying to find out what happened to her family after they left the workhouse. Her grandmother, Edith, married John Simpson in 1910, and they went on to have 3 children together. 14 years later, those same children, Barbara's mother's siblings, would also end up in Ripon Workhouse.
Here, Norman Simpson, Simpson Francis, Simpson Edith.
All 3 children were admitted on the same day, the 22nd of December, 24.
1924?
Yes.
My grandmother was dead.
Was dead.
So what happened to Mr. Simpson? Was he dead or alive, or...?
No mention of him coming in.
Simpson. Here we go. Simpson Norman, Simpson Francis, Simpson Edith, and they all left at the same time. Discharged into care of NSPCC. What does that say?
It says for removal.
Removed to Dr. Bernardo's home.
Yes.
The National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children had been given statutory powers in 1889 which allowed them to take vulnerable children into care. Using these powers, they plucked the Simpson children from Ripon Workhouse and placed them in the custody of Dr. Bernardo's, a private charity established to look after orphaned and abandoned children. And Barbara is writing to see if they can shed any light on what happened to her mother's brothers and sisters. In Cumbria, Felicity Kendall's great-grandmother Mary Liddell had to give up her son Albert to the workhouse when she was pregnant with another child, Claude. Having lost Albert to the system, Mary then lost Claude when he died of diarrhea aged 18 months, a common cause of infant death amongst the poor. Claude would have been Felicity's great-uncle. He is buried in Ulverston Cemetery.
Is that the number of the grave?
The grave number's 344A. Just I line them up using those headstones there, and it's in this area.
Oh my goodness.
With there not being a headstone, it's difficult to identify it precisely on the ground. Can I leave you at the graveside?
Yes, yes. I wouldn't do flowers, because I'm Jewish, so I'm just going to lay some stones. And there's your view, little Claude. Oh dear, oh dear. Well, I think the thing about Mary, one of the things that I'm taking away from her story, is that it was tragic, and this obviously is the ultimate tragedy. But having buried little Claude, she may have been grateful that at least Albert was safe, and that he would be looked after. But I don't know. You know, the other way you would react as a mother is, oh my goodness, what if he's ill? And I can't be there to hold his hand and mop his brow.
The authorities prevented Mary from seeing Albert again. She moved to another workhouse and disappeared from his life. Albert stayed in Ulverston Workhouse until he was 16 years old. With no known family to go to, he faced the issue of what to do with the rest of his life. The stigma of the workhouse meant that Albert had limited job opportunities in the world outside. So, in 1915, he followed the example of thousands of other workhouse boys and enlisted to join the army. Back in Yorkshire, Barbara Taylor Bradford is with her husband, Bob. Dr. Bernardo's have responded to her letter of inquiry.
Oh, well, this is interesting. It's from Dr. Bernardo's. Let me see what is here. I can't work. Oh, it's all about, I saw names of my mother's brothers and sisters. All right.
Good. Go ahead, then.
Frida's mother married John Thomas Simpson, and he is stated in the records to be often unemployed and a drunk. Well, she didn't obviously have good taste in men. Following the mother's death, the children were grossly neglected. When an NSPCC inspector visited the family, they found the children to be in a dirty and verminous condition.
Oh, God.
The children were twice admitted to Ripon Workhouse, and Simpson was later fined £5 for their neglect. In February 1925, Simpson was serving a 3-month prison sentence for their further neglect. Not a happy story at all. No wonder I was never told this story by my mother.
Oh.
Following their admission to Barnardo's on 30th of May 1923, they were migrated to New South Wales in Australia.
Barbara's aunts and uncles were sent to the colonies as part of a wider scheme that dated back to the 1700s to resettle poor children thousands of miles away from their parents and the roots of poverty. In Scotland, Patrick McCann's youngest son Samuel was living with foster parents in Ayrshire, almost 100 miles away from his father and home city of Glasgow. Patrick also had 2 grown-up sons. They too had left Glasgow and moved to Dundee on the east coast of Scotland, leaving Patrick alone in his battle against chronic illness and poverty. As a disabled man with no family support, Patrick had not only given his last child Samuel over to care, he'd also given up his rights as a parent.
Glasgow liked to foster well away from Glasgow city itself. And the reason for that was quite simple. It did not want the parent to suddenly turn up. And in fact, it would not tell the parent where their child was fostered.
So they didn't know where their child was?
No.
So we imagine that when Patrick said goodbye to Samuel,
yes,
there was the distinct possibility in Patrick's brain that he was never going to see him again?
That's right, yes. He might never see him again because...
And equally the little boy would feel the same?
Probably feel the same. If he knew what was happening, he'd probably feel, well, that might be the last time I see my father and my brothers.
That's scary.
The assumption was that he'd stay with his foster parents till he became of age 14.
Do we know what happened to him?
We know that he went to reside with his brothers in Dundee.
So he went to Dundee. Yeah, see,
And more than that, we know that his father turned up in Dundee, and that's the last recorded occasion we have.
So
when
Patrick Senior actually got to Dundee?
Yes. We know that all the 3 brothers were residing in Dundee in 1908, and their father came to see him. And that's the last recorded occasion when we see in these records the family being together, the father with these 3 boys.
1908?
1908, for at least a month.
Clearly they made an effort to get back together as a family. But no women, you see. That's the problem. Except 1908?
Yes.
Oh my God! My mother would have been 2.
Right.
So you would have seen his granddaughter?
Yes, yes. So he'd have seen his daughter-in-law and his granddaughter.
Oh.
And you can see they're all residing at the same address in Lochee, Dundee.
That's incredible, because I had it in my mind that he was on his own and he... Yeah. Yeah, we see his wee granddaughter. She would have been 2.
Three years after being reunited with his sons and meeting his baby granddaughter, Patrick died of pneumonia. He was just 54 years old.
It's an amazing story, but it's also a testimony to a whole time and period and a group of people who are not taken care of and have never been taken care of. We've never really dealt with our poor from generation to generation. These situations teach you that the only way is this sense of our responsibility for one another. That's the only way. And if we don't have that sense of responsibility for one another, our world is chaos.
By 1914, the workhouse authorities had succeeded in creating a generation of fit and healthy young men out of pauper children. Stigmatized and unwanted, the obvious place for boys brought up in one institution was another one: the army. Now the moment had arrived for them to come forward in their country's hour of need, as they volunteered in their thousands to fight in the First World War. Amongst these workhouse recruits was Felicity Kendall's great-uncle, Albert Liddell.
So we know he enlisted in 1915, and in 1916 he was sent to the front, and he was sent to Ypres just on the eve of the second big battle there, which was slaughter. He was very lucky. He had just come from training in the UK, and he didn't see action straight away, but then he did see a lot of very significant action after that. So, I mean, he must have had a bit of a charmed life to get through all of that.
That's extraordinary. But that's a miracle that he wasn't wounded.
He's extraordinarily lucky.
And what is this?
That's just the record of his service. He shows that he got the British War Medal, Victory Medal. It's not a decoration for honour, it's just a kind of, I was there.
Yes, but it is nice to have.
You know,
I mean,
well
that's
done.
huge. That is huge. That is huge to have something written down that says this is what you've achieved. That must have given him quite a...
Yeah. I mean, for a pauper child from the workhouse to have served, to have survived, to have received a medal. Having a medal, this must have been the first time in Albert's life that anyone had ever said to him, "You're special." And it might have meant that when he came home, people saw him differently.
I think that would have made all the difference in the world to him.
Yeah.
Extraordinary.
After the First World War, the government offered Albert and all other returning soldiers free passage to Australia. The post-war economy in Britain was in recession, and for a workhouse child, emigration offered the chance to build a new life free from the stigma of pauperism. 17,000 ex-soldiers took up the offer to establish themselves as colonists and pioneers. Albert left for Australia in 1922. Barbara Taylor Bradford's mother's siblings all ended up in the colonies as well, but they didn't volunteer. They were sent there by Dr. Barnardo's, having originally been taken into the care of the workhouse. Barnardo's was one of a number of charitable organisations who, backed by the British government, took pauper children and forced them to migrate to the other side of the world. The last one of Barbara's family to leave England was the youngest of her aunts and uncles, little Edith. By now, Barbara's mother, Frida, was married and working as a nurse in Leeds.
Bob, now look, this is from my mother.
Dr. Barnardo's have sent copies of letters they exchanged with Frida.
Dear Madam, she's writing to Barnardo's. I write to you to ask you if you can give me any information concerning my youngest sister by name Edith Simpson. She was taken into one of your homes when she was a small child, between 5 and 7 years. Oh, how sad. She didn't know where her little sister was. Now, here is the reply. Dear Madam, your sister Edith went out to Australia with one of our parties in April 1928. And Edith is extremely happy and is getting on nicely out there. The principal says that Edith has good reports all around. Dear Miss Picton Turberville, she now has a name, it has taken a great load off my mind to know little Edith is still alive and doing so well. I am so glad to know that. She may have thought she was dead.
Yes.
But now I am happily married and have a nice cottage of my own in a nice part of the city. I have been hoping that I might be allowed to bring Edith to live with me, as I could take good care of her now. God, she wanted a sister. I want to ask this one favour of you. Do you think she would be allowed to come home and let me have her to live with me? Oh, she wanted her little sister, didn't she? Please don't think me selfish. Sorry. Please don't think me selfish wishing to have her now when you have cared for her and educated her and brought her up to be such a good girl. But it is just a longing for my own people. My mother must have longed. She says it, my own people.
Yes, of course. It's tragic, this whole thing.
Dear Mrs. Taylor, I write to say that I am afraid we could not bear the expense of bringing Edith back to England, even if it were decided it would be well for her to return. I am not quite clear from your letter when you say that you would like to bring her back, whether it would be possible for you to pay the expense involved. Now this is going to throw you. Which would be from £32 to £36. But they didn't,
expense.
But they didn't have it, Mummy and Daddy.
They
didn't have that kind of money to spare.
She was a good woman.
Well, that I know. She really was.
In total, 150,000 children were sent overseas under the scheme. The last of them left Britain as recently as 1967. Since then, there has been official acknowledgement of the cruelty of this forcible migration policy. In 2010, Prime Minister Gordon Brown formally apologised to all those families who had been affected. Frida died without ever seeing her sister again. Bernardo's last known record of Edith was that she was still living in Western Australia in 1937. Felicity Kendall's great-uncle, Albert, made the most of his opportunity in Australia and ended up owning his own farm.
The first record we have is this one, his certificate of marriage. He married Rachel, an Australian woman.
Rachel, my favourite name. What I'd love to know, is he called Billy?
He was called
Bob.
Bert.
Bert?
Bert. They called him Bert.
Oh, Bert.
And he's listed as a farmer.
And Mary is there as his mother and father. Oh my goodness, he's got John Little there.
It's amazing, isn't it?
John Little was Mary's husband, the man who threw her out when she became pregnant illegitimately with Albert.
He lists John Little as his father.
That's mind-bending. He has joined his family together. He's got John and he's got his mother on the same piece of paper that he is on, and he's sort of legitimised himself. And I think that is one of the incredibly important things in this story, is that he's come from nothing, totally legitimate and the bottom of the heap and not respectable. And he ends up with respectability.
Yeah. There is one other thing that we know about his relationship with the family back in England, and this is his will.
Oh my goodness. Oh, he had an awful lot of money. 4,000 to Janet Little Waring, usually known as Jenny Little Waring. But who is that?
So this is his half niece. We don't know what kind of relationship there was here, but clearly he knew his family and he knew the next generation. He must have made contact with John and his family. Now, we don't know how that happened. I suspect it might have been when he comes back from the war, because the war really did change things. Maybe his family had decided that, after the horrors of war, Albert or Bert meant something different to the family now, because he was a decorated war veteran. He'd come back with the Victory Medal and he had served and survived. Maybe they felt that they could now acknowledge him. After all this history of secrecy and, lies, infidelity, betrayal, Albert had made peace with it, that he had made peace with his family. He died a successful man, really.
What a wonderful
Emotionally
story.
and financially. Yes.
Well done, Bert. Little boy. Fantastic.
The early Victorian pioneers of the workhouse viewed poverty as a crime. But as the 20th century unfolded, there was a growing sense that it was a social problem, which could only be treated by showing greater compassion. In this new world order, the idea of a deterrent workhouse looked increasingly outdated. Over time, many of its functions had been discharged to specialized institutions like pauper schools and free hospitals for the poor, as a new model of social welfare began to take shape. In 1929, the workhouse was formally abolished by an Act of Parliament, although it took almost 20 years to phase out altogether. With the introduction of the NHS in 1948, the last workhouse shut up shop as its remaining functions were absorbed into the welfare state. Today, almost all physical traces of the institution have been covered up or erased. But its shadow, nonetheless, falls over millions of people whose lives have been touched by their families' secrets from the workhouse.
Two sons in search of their father. If you missed last night's episode of Long Lost Family, go to ITV Player to catch up. Comedy drama continues tomorrow night as Ken and Pauline try counselling in Love and Marriage at 9.